Build network automation tools and share them with your entire network operations team safely and reliably. You can do this with Itential. Visit itential.com to find out more. That's itential.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, where we explore the latest in network automation from a practitioner's perspective. I'm your host, Eric Cho, a network engineer who loves everything about network automation. Today, we're very excited to have Bart Dorlandt start with us, a veteran and visionary in the field of network automation. We'll explore Bart's insights and his network automation journey, his focus on the process over the tools, reflecting on the importance of mentorship and the reality that most of us aren't working on massive projects. But that does not mean we need to stop making progress. Bart will also dive into the mindsets of innovation, sharing his motto, there must be a better way, which I really love. So join us as we navigate the path of network automation and discover Bart's passion that drives this innovation. So welcome to the show, Bart. First of all, I want to apologize. We practiced your last name, but I butchered it. So please, once and for all, let us know how we should all pronounce your last name.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. My name is Bart Dorlandt, and it's a terrible name for non-Dutch speaking people, right? It's always a challenge.
The inventor of Python is indeed Dutch, right? So we should all thank the greater race for bringing us all into the wonderful language of Python. But we're here to talk about network automation. So we'll put that aside for now. So Bart, tell us your origin story, right? Like that's always a good place to start. Where did you come from? And how did you end up with network automation as your kind of main object right now for your career?
Times have changed, right? I've been working for 20 years now, which come to realize I'm like one of the old guys now. And the origin is networking, right? That's where it started. That's what I love. And then about 10 years ago or so, I thought, yeah, do I want to generate configurations in Notepad and adding VLANs for the rest of my life and doing it that way? Like, yeah,
That doesn't sound too appeasing, is it?
that's not going to be
There's
it. There
no
must be
no
indeed a better way of doing that.
Yeah, there's no tour engineer title, not anymore that I saw. So good thing that you switched.
Indeed, indeed. So yes, I mean, if we look now, I had this recent massive project to implement BMP, the BGP monitoring protocol, and I did a podcast on that on Packet Pushers on the Heavy Networking channel. So I'm sure we'll throw a link in the notes, right?
Yep.
But that was a huge project, right? And you mentioned Guido van Rossum for Python, right? Python
Right.
being his huge project, right? But not everything is as big. So we'll talk about it on the show and make sure that we celebrate the tiny things or the small things as well, because automation should be fun. It is fun for me. And let's dive in on that.
Yeah, I mean, interesting that you mentioned about, networking was your original passion and continue to be, but it's kind of half and half, I would say. But how did you came into like networking? I would say not in the US. The US, I don't see a lot of, say, university undergrads with, network engineering as the major. Most of them are, CS or for myself, computer information system, management information system, which is business focused, but with a computer on the kind of a side dish, right? So did you study network engineering back in school, or was that just all of the on-job learning?
It was actually, so I always confuse the American titles, right? We got the high school in the Netherlands, which is not equivalent to the term high school in the US.
Hmm.
It's like the level where you reach the bachelor.
Okay, so kind of like a university level, like age 18 to 22 in the US is like secondary education.
Right. Okay. So that was towards networking. Communication technology was the title.
Hmm.
So that was focused on networking. So there was CCNA in that as well. And then after that, I did the university. So that's the master part, master science. And that went into open source, open software, open systems area. So for me, it was twofold. But the networking part was where I found my passion, what I liked, and configuring and making big things communicate. So that's indeed where it started.
When you talk about networking, was it pretty much analog? Was it like telecommunication where like PBX, for example, or ISDN, high-speed networking, or was it all digital? Because I think that's right around the time where everything becomes digitized, right? So if you're working for a telephone company or telcos or cable company, you may still deal with a somewhat analog world, but most of us at that time will already transition into a digital. It's all packet switching, or at the very least, digitized.
Yeah, so I pretty much started in the digital, right? There were some of the aspects. So in between the two studies before going to do my master's, I was working at the university or the high school, right? On that company, on the school, essentially building the networks. And I had a project for them moving to voice over IP at the time using Cisco. But yeah, for that or to understand that, I needed a bit of knowledge on the PBX world and how that architecture was set up for the entire school system, et cetera, before even thinking about moving to voice over IP.
Yeah, so mostly on the looking back or making sure digital is on par with the analog experience and how they rate like voice quality and so on. And how do you, I guess some of the tricky part like jitters or, delays and all that stuff for your voice IP project. And you mentioned Cisco, and it seems like even back in the school days, you already started with Cisco. And I bet you we talked about this. So I kind of cheated, right? Like, I know you have a bunch of Cisco certifications. So tell us a little bit about your Cisco experience, maybe starting from just what you're feeling about certification at the time and now.
Well, it has been a journey for sure, right? So at the time of studying or at school, it's part of the program. Like it's not like you have a choice like, oh, there's going to be the CCNA. Well, forget about that. Let me take Univer or another vendor because it's part of the system of the program. So you take it and while you're studying it and taking a job that there used to be a lot of Cisco, right? These days perhaps a little bit less, but there's still a bunch of them. And they're still very big on the education part of it, right? I probably think that and they are the biggest on that part at least, even though they might be losing some market here and there. They're big on that area. And a lot of companies were and are still using that. So having the certificates for it is useful for getting in, right? I spent most of my career in consultancy companies, and then you are the product, right? So having certificates and being able to go through a funnel of matching certificates and making check boxes to be able to be selected on an interview is quite important, right? So yeah, because of that, I went through the cycle, right, of CCNA, CCNP. Then I got challenged by my boss, like, okay, well, you know stuff very broadly and you love everything about tech. So maybe it's time for you to take a challenge. And why don't you go for a CCIE and have a try, right?
Not to mention there's certain discounts for a VAR or whatnot.
True, which wasn't necessarily the case for us since we were a relatively small company. But nevertheless, he challenged me. I didn't take up on this at that specific point in time. But yeah, later on I did actually. It's obviously not only about the title, right? The title is cool. And yes, when you got it, you're one of the selected few, as Cisco will put it, to ever manage to get that number or the certificate. And that is awesome on its own. But having the mindset and the dedication and really knowing the nitty gritty details, the bits and the bytes, as you would say, on everything that involved in that program is going to stay with you for the rest of your career, right? Some things might dumb down a bit, but overall, the mindset, knowing how these things were built either from an architecture of the networking platforms or even from certain parts of coding perspective, right? It gives you the architecture in it that you can map to a lot of things.
Yeah, I agree. And I was only half joking because I also came up doing the certification route like you did. And for us, because I was working for a VAR, there's certain number of IEs or NPs certified personnel needs to be on staff in order for them to guarantee the next tier. There's certain sales quota you have to meet, but also those are the hard requirements. And therefore, there's real tangible incentive for the company to sponsor your study path. And, obviously they could be nice people, but at the same time, there's real, dollar hanging in front of him. And therefore, that was one of the incentive for us to go through. But I think you're right on for anything that was difficult. It's one thing about the subject itself. There's no going around on accumulating a large amount of accumulation of effort on this subject become that subject matter. So the technical bits, but also there's the intangible part where you're learning how to learning how your style is. Some people are more visual, some people are more bookworms like myself, but all of them needs to require, hands-on practice and so on. So I'm glad you brought this up on, just the two bits. One is the technical portion where there's accumulation of knowledge on this particular subject, which is Cisco, but also there's the macro skill set where you learn how to learn and you do the deliberate practice, fail forward, all that kind of stuff. So you mentioned you got your CCIE and that's a path in itself and accomplishment. So congratulations on that part. And then, you somehow got into the automation bits, right? But I imagine that big project that you talked about for, heavy networking episode, that wasn't your first scripting project, right? So tell us about that on-run process of you're already an expert, but now you're almost starting new on this new project or this new field of automation that is exciting, but yet at the same time, you're probably may not be the smartest person in the room. So tell us that journey.
Yeah. So this started, right, as I mentioned previously. So after I passed my CCA exam, I had this moment of like, okay, I was working at AT&T for Shell, and this is one of the largest networks that you can play on in the enterprise, right? And that also helped during the study for the CCA exam, right? I barely had to study QoS because
That was your life.
yeah, the QoS policy map at Shell was already 3 papers long, right? So by understanding that, you were halfway through the exam on that part. But having all of that, right, and having a lot of people touching the network, right, it guarantees some instability, right? Either naming, either the way people do it, or the documentation that's written. Somewhere there is just,
Kind of like a drift in configuration.
it's not stable, right?
Sure. There's definitely differences in approaches.
Yeah. And with that, I was like, okay, we had these changes on the network, and there were networks being added, and there were prefixes being added on either OSPF, etc., and they needed to be propagated into BGP, which was done through network statements, and nobody had challenges with adding those. Right, adding those was the easy breezy part. Everybody did that. But when it came to taking networks offline again, everybody, quote unquote, forgot to remove the network statements in BGP. So essentially, over time, that caused a mismatch, perhaps in certain cases, gigantic mismatch, right,
A very dangerous mismatch. Yeah.
on what is there actually and what is not, and how that applies to the network.
Right.
I was like, oh, we can do that by hand and have a look at that, or we can not do it by hand, which is the preferred choice. I'm like, okay, I didn't know a real programming language, if I can call Bash a non-real programming language, right?
Some of my friends might differ, but yes.
Very true, very true. So Bash was what I knew from a scripting perspective. I had done some Java during university and some other things, but uh, they all didn't stick per se. Plus, Bash is there. It's present on Linux and it was there to use. So I started doing that and just being able to parse a routing table against the actual network statements in BGP and then essentially generating a diff out of those and getting a list.
How did you get the table into, you said Bash, right? So I assume it's like a Linux platform. So how did you get those in the first place to do the diff from? Was it just copy and paste, or did you use like a simple Python or libraries?
So I didn't know Python at the time, right?
Okay,
So this was just, hey, here's my network statements of this router, and here's the routing table, and throw it in text files and then parse those
got it.
just to get something started to make it semi-automatic, right? At least to be able to grab those bits and pieces of information, throw them in text files, run it, and then get a diff. So I did not have any automatic configuration or whatsoever, but just being able to not doing things by hand and being able to script this part already was already saving so much time and being able to take necessary actions afterwards, right? There was this whole change implementation plan that needed to be written for pretty much everything. So it was not the time yet of automatic configuration management and Gift and CI/CD and whatsoever. These were the early days, right? We were already happy having SSH and being rid of Telnet, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was that era.
I like how you put it, right? Like that was a win, and a win is a win. And that's how I started as well. I don't know if we talked about this. I've certainly talked about it with my other guests as well. But yeah, set and awk, that's how I started too. It was just manually moving a file, but the file was huge and ginormous, and you could go through it line by line, but that would take you days. But set and awk and just kind of, using space as a separator and just parse out the things that you want to see, and then use awk to, kind of organize the output, and that was a big win, and that kind of give whet your appetite, right? So even without Python, I mean, we're big fans of Python, but even without quote unquote serious programming languages or Java, then we could still get a win. And that's how you started. That's how I started. And from there, I suppose you wanted more and you wanted to get into some sort of language and having better if else statements.
Very true, very true. So at this time, I got challenged by a colleague. He said, "Well, maybe it's time for you to learn a real programming language."
Quote unquote real. And you're like, no, Shell
Yeah.
is great.
And so, as I mentioned, I was working for a consultancy company, right?
Yeah.
There was an endpoint at AT&T and Shell, so I went to another one, and the network was far simpler than and less huge than what Shell had. So that gave me the opportunity, like, okay, well, this is more automatable. It was more standardized
Yeah.
in a way and less complex, and giving me the opportunity to take a action on that and seeing, okay, well, maybe it is time to learn a different language. So I went into Python, right? I told him I went into Python, and that was actually not what he had in mind at the time. He was writing a lot of Perl.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So that was a good point. How did you decide into Python? Because right now, today, when people ask for opinions or, they look around on the ecosystem, they will probably decide on Python if they're just, kind of care to look. But back then, the Perl was the dominant language, and you mentioned exactly that. So how did you decide on Python?
This is digging in memory, right? This is back in the days.
It's okay if we miss a few details. How did you decide on Python and how did you learn about it? I guess we could kind of combine the two questions.
Google existed, right? So we're not that
Yeah, they
old.
sure did. Yes.
I was just Googling on what could be the thing, right?
Hmm.
I had heard about it, but never written in it per se, right? And I knew that there were libraries out there available, especially focused on the network communication. So like NetMiko, right? It existed.
Yes.
And we're talking now 10 years ago, more or less, right? So that existed. I was like, okay, well, I need to communicate to Cisco iOS box, right? How do I do it? And then Python and NetMiko come up and like, okay, well, that seems like a reasonable choice to go there and to dive into that.
Right.
So yeah, started with that. I was addicted to YouTube at the time just by studying, right? I wanted to get things going. I was programming a bit at work to achieve communication towards the boxes or getting information from it and parsing that and dealing with the different bits and pieces from the network devices, right? Either being the ports or the subnets or just parsing a chauffeur to get some data from that. And I loved it, right? Being able to get the information from there. I was just, if I wasn't coding myself during work, then in the evening I was just continuously watching YouTubes. I was mainly following a guy called Raymond Hettinger.
Hmm.
Not sure if he's still one of the core people of Python.
Yeah, I think he was definitely a core contributor, but he was very pure Python.
Yeah, well, at the time, yes, but I'm not sure
Yeah.
if he's still now. But he was posting on Twitter. It was called Twitter these days, right? So he was posting on Twitter also like small little things on how to improve the simple things. But he had tons of videos on the different events and conferences that he presented, and I just loved the way he did that. So yeah, just continuously watching videos and using that Miko. I spoke to Kirk online at the time also to deal with that.
Oh, really? Okay, nice.
Yeah, to get things going because that was, I remember, that was the part where he changed his code to go from time based, like waiting for a response and how to deal with that, towards recognizing the prompts and therefore making it a lot quicker and not timing out on information and deal with that.
Right.
So that was the time that he moved into that version of his code to do that. So yeah, it's a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did not say it, but for me, at least, I struggle with Perl. So, there's different kind of mindsets between Perl and Python, and we could go into that a little at a future date. But I went to Language Summit where both Larry Wall and Guido van Rossum was talking about their design philosophy on the languages. That was when I finally realized why I had struggled so much with Perl versus like a kind of Python's structure just fits my brain. Guido meaning a mathematician, and Larry being I think it was music, right? Like I think it was a musician, so there's always more than one way to do things, and they appreciate the different ways versus always one best way to do it in a math sense. But yeah, you also mentioned NetMiko. I think that's around the same time where, the community was growing and Kirk was leading the way. So it's interesting that you mentioned the Raymond Hettinger's videos because I think at that time there was not a lot about network automation instructions or network automation education materials. And therefore you have to learn Python and then overlay, make the connection between Python and network automation by yourself versus there's like dedicated like source of truth or, the CI/CD pipeline just for network engineers nowadays. So an interesting question that came up would be that, knowing the differences, if you're just looking back at that time, as you mentioned, 10 plus years ago versus now, what kind of recommendation would you give to people if today they want to go into network automation? What's the first step that they should look at?
Yeah, that's always a challenging question, right? But I would say the main thing is focus on what you get out of it, right? I mean, in a sense, like learning a vendor tool will get you so far,
Right.
right? And can still be beneficial, right? And there also a vendor tool has an architecture and has everything behind it, which usually matches whatever other vendors and open source things are doing, right? A certain architecture makes sense to have and to implement. So as long as you're not too focused on how specifically the tool works from the buttons and the mouse perspective, but having the knowledge around it, everything can be a good start. If you have that in your environment at your work and that's what people use already and you want to dive in that, that's a perfect first choice. But also keep in mind, it's not the only thing out there, right? So be curious as well, right? And if you are in the position to choose a vendor, perhaps, or you have something coming up at work, you're going to choose a new vendor, maybe you should judge on the API or the absence or presence and the correctness or completeness along with the documentation around that API, because that says a lot these days, right? Where we used to do text parsing, right? That was the way, that was the API.
Yeah.
But these days, there's far more choices and far better ways of doing it.
Yeah, I agree. And just to double click on what you said on, if there's already a team or there's a set opinion at work, it's almost always recommended to go with that versus if you go against that, it's almost swimming upstreams that you will, make certain progress, but the upstream, just the current's going to carry you down a little bit. Just, for example, if you're a quote unquote Cisco shop and you really want to learn Juniper, sure, you're free to do that, but you're not going to make as much gain as, maybe like you said, your opinion on the API, on the vendor, and follow their opinionated way, but also knowing there's other ways out there. So be curious about other ways, but at the same time, you want to make the most gain, get that win, get those confidence in your belly just to go forward. So I like that recommendation of depending on your position, take your next step so that you get the most gain out of it rather than, in my opinion, swimming upstream against the current.
Yeah, and there's the third alternative, right? I mean, if you have people around you that are in that position where you want to be, right? They are in network automation or in automation in general, right? Having a mentor is so incredible, right? I didn't really had one during my career or only occasionally. So all the Python was self-taught, right? At that company, I was the person doing the implementation.
You were teaching.
Well, at one point also, but I started doing things like, okay, well, if I need to gather all this information from the boxes, I'm not going to do it by hand, right? I'll tell you one, I wrote a script at one point that would get the layer 2 switches, the layer 3 switch, it would get all the MAC addresses, and all of that information was useful for the company or had a meaning, right? So
Right.
getting all the MAC addresses and also being able to match that against the ARP table on the layer 3 switch and making all this correlation between everything, knowing on which port on the which it was and the IP address that belonged to it, and there was the voice over IP. So having two VLANs, etc., all on that.
Yeah.
And grabbing all of that information, then being able to throw that in an Excel sheet or have the option between CSV or Excel sheet at the time. And I was able to do that, right? I just learned about threading. So that was awesome. I could do and talk to all these devices at the same time. Like, okay, cool. And then within like 20 seconds, it would get all the data, throw it in an Excel sheet, and poof, done the whole site. I got that in an inventory, right?
That's amazing. Yeah.
And I wrote that, and it was literally, I think, on a Wednesday, I finished with it. Like, I gave it to a colleague at operations, and he's like, okay, this is a script, right? This is how you run it. Know that it exists, and if you need to run it for whatever reason, then use it, right? So within 2 days, some site manager came to us like, hey, I'd like to know all of the information I just said for this site. Can you help me? And well, he was off on Thursday. So on Friday, he clicked the button. It generated the Excel sheet, threw it back there. And this guy came over to us and he's like, what the have happened here? The last time that I requested this, it took 3 months.
Got it.
And just having that directly delivered to his mailbox, he was just, yeah, it blew his mind. Like, even I was getting fun with it. So it was even coloring, right? If the port was switched to up down state over the last 30 or above 30 days, it turned red or something like that, right? So they were doing a project with ICE, Cisco ICE, right? Before that, they're just like, well, if it's not used 60 days, we should turn it off, right? Or turn
Hmm.
it down administratively. So being able to generate such a sheet and just go, okay, let's disable all these ports, right? For quote unquote security perspective. That was so powerful for them. So yeah, that was one of my highlights that I did there.
That's great. That's great. How long did it take from, say, going from just learning the print statements, the hello worlds, and bridging, watching videos and bridging that to network engineering until you have that, shiny moment that still shines in your brain years after? How long did it take you to go from that to, making significant contribution at work and having everybody's buy off?
Yeah, that's not a binary answer, right?
Sure. Yeah, like 640 days.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a year, right? It was like half a year maybe or so, but it's a journey. Like
Yeah.
everything in automation or network automation is a journey. And every next day you build on the previous, right? So you continuously improve and increase, right? And you get those moments where you look back on your older code and you're like, I write that. I hope nobody finds this.
Right, right.
And especially in the beginning, you are happy when you made it work, and that is good, right? And don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise, right? The moment you're starting and the moment you're building your first things and having it work is good, right? And good is better than perfect, especially at that point in time.
Yeah, I would agree. The reason I ask is because previously, we've had guests on where, like you say, it's a process. And to go from just a hello world into contribution, everybody's a little bit different in between. However, sometimes people will look at that last step and falsely presume that like last step, that incremental process is what made the difference. So for example, maybe somebody has been learning for 3 4 months and then they took this course maybe with Kirk, maybe with somebody else, and then all of a sudden they were able to write the script and present it to their employer and make significant contributions. So everybody would say, oh my god, that's the magic bullet, everybody should go take that course. But previous 2 3 months, 4 months, the person was actually quietly experimenting with different languages. He or she was doing work at night, correlating these in the brain. So I think it's really point out that this is a process, this is a mindset, and that these are all incrementally, as you said, Bart, that people build on top of each other. But before we dive into that story, which is a great story, you mentioned the role of a mentor. So I want to kind of drill in on that a little bit because I've heard you talk about it a few times now. So in what way do you think the mentor could help you? And what is the significance of a mentor? And how do you find one, right? Like for people who's listening, it's like, yeah, great. Like it would be awesome if I have a mentor, but how do I locate one?
Yeah, having somebody that can guide you, right? And
Yeah.
no matter where you are in your journey, if you have somebody, and even if he's at the same level, right, you have somebody to spar against. You can have like, well, I saw this, I'm not sure how I deal with that, or I'm thinking about implementing, I'm having a requirements file now and I want to use poetry, but I don't know how, or there's this new kid on the block, a UV, how do I deal with that?
Yeah.
And being able to spar with somebody is very helpful.
Yeah.
All right. If you have somebody that has a ton of experience already, then he can definitely save you some pitfalls, right? And that
Right.
if he would only do that, that is already worth something, right?
Yes. Already paying dividends. Yeah. For the time you invested in finding it.
So what I did, right? So after my period at this company and learning Python, I was like,
Hmm.
okay, well, automation, it's the network automation, it's the thing, right? I
It's
want
the
to
bomb. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the bomb. Yeah, I want to do that. I want to keep doing that, but it needs to be better, right?
Hmm.
Sure, I've now done a bunch of scripts on Python, and that was either scraping boxes or did a whole project for ICE to implement that, and that also used automation for that. But I can reinvent the wheel myself. That's one way, and I will learn a ton by doing that. But doing it alone takes a long time.
Yeah.
Or I can actually start working at a company that does network automation and only network automation, right?
Hmm.
So a couple of months ago, you had Wim Gerrits on the show, right, with
Yep.
NetPicker, Slurpit, NetIce.
That's right.
So I think it's about 7 years ago that I joined NetIce. So I knew Wim already, and we became in contact again at that time. It was just a perfect point in time, right? I knew and got into network automation, where he had a company doing only network automation,
Right.
though albeit being it a vendor tool, right? But
Yeah.
again, and that's where I came from previously, is like having the mindset around it and the architecture and the modeling and how this all is done. And NetEyes was so useful already, and having meeting the people that built that and having that mental model of how it should be or how it could be in there was for me already a mentor on that perspective, where I went just from a script kiddie, if I can call myself that, into somebody that looks at a larger picture, like, oh yeah, actually we want a kind of a source of truth, or where we store the data, how we can reuse that data and generate templates based on that, or doing enhancement on tickets or APIs and doing all these kind of stuff, which upped my game at that time.
Yeah, I like that because that's kind of challenging the traditional thinking of mentorship, right? So I've actually had my previous mentor at Microsoft, Monica Machado, on the show the previous couple of shows ago. And that was a very traditional sense, right? Like the company actually dedicated a group of pool of talent of people who they do the matching between like people who are willing to teach and people who are willing to learn. And we have this formal process set up, maybe bi-weekly, just having lunch, having coffee, whatnot. And I could actually tell people like she's my mentor and this is the advice that my mentor gave me. But on the other hand, it's kind of hard to have that, and not everybody company have that. So the non-traditional sense, the non-linear way would be, like you took your career into your own hands. Or I would actually, kind of challenge people to just find mentor for a particular aspect or even a virtual one, where now we have network automation forum where we saw each other, right? Like AutoCon 2. And just watching these speak and having maybe Jeremy Schulman on, he's my, kind of virtual mentor on this particular aspect. Maybe Bart on the mindset and, Bart on his taking his career by his own hands, or somebody else that you kind of identify as quote unquote mentor and just kind of bouncing ideas from. And nowadays, because the community is stronger and bigger, that you should be able to find some sort of mentor or virtual ones just for that matter. So I like the fact that you kind of mentioned the mentorship as you frame it, it's not a traditional linear path, but rather just, somebody who's you could bounce off ideas from, get experience from, and grow from each other's experience.
Yeah, very true. So especially these days, right?
Yeah.
The world has changed so much, right? Not only in network automation, right? But let's focus on that part. I mean, it's not only the techniques and the protocols, it's this whole community that became essentially where it wasn't 10 years ago, it wasn't 5 years
Oh
ago.
yeah, certainly not. Yeah.
It's like, hey, I mean, we got a conference now about network automation.
Yes. Imagine that.
Imagine that, and that you meet like-minded people that are
Yeah.
doing kind of the same thing as you do,
For
right?
4 days, you talk nothing but network automation.
Very true. And where previously you had like, well, still exists the Cisco Live and things, and you might be,
Yeah, but that's only like on the corner, right? Like the DevNet corner or whatever.
yeah, and that was networking, right?
Right.
Especially in the beginning. And these days, of course, they got their part in AI and they got their part in automation, etc. But it's so much more present, right? So you can just jump on the Slack channel, throw a question out there, and you will get a response in minutes, period.
Yeah.
And no matter the time zone.
Yeah. Like you're probably at an off different time zone than I do. So to answer questions. So there's 24-hour, follow the sun, quote unquote mentors that's there to help answer your questions.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a few times about mindsets. So we have to dive into that. There must be a better way, right? So tell us a little bit about this particular mindset that you have and how it help you.
Yeah, so I don't know when I started living by it, because
Hmm.
that's literally what I do. And I don't apply it only to network automation per se or programming or whatever it may be,
Hmm.
though that applies there very much as well, right?
Podcast recording, there must be a better way.
Very true, right? It's already asynchronous, so we came
Yeah.
already a
Yeah,
long way,
yeah.
right?
We just have to have some AI to it. Oh, wait a minute. We already have that. But anyway,
Yeah.
sorry to diverge. Go ahead. There must be a better way.
Yeah, I mean, it can be the small things, right? So if we talk tech, it's like, oh, Makefile, as an example, has been here for since the 70s, right?
Yeah.
It's ancient, right? And at one point, it's like I came across like, oh, there must be somebody that made this better, right? The syntax is not something that I would scream, yay.
Somebody must have solved it, or somebody at least encountered the question. Yeah.
Yeah, so and then you look at it for it, and then it's like, hey, there are three, four, five alternatives. Like, okay, let me look at those, and I got into task file and I love it, right? I did a tech session on that the other day on packet coders.
Okay.
It can be the little things like,
Yeah.
well, bike file, it works, right? Most of the time you just need 1, 2, 3, 4 entries. But if it can be easier or simpler and more readable, then that's a win, right? That's a better way. And it can be from poetry going to UV, right? It's
Right.
the new kid on the block and it's so much faster and everything works. And yeah, then it's like, okay, well, now I have to migrate all my repos and they're all using poetry. Okay, well, you write a tool for that and that making something even better, right? Personally, for me as a first, but I share it out there and people are using that now. I had a merge request or an issue the other day that something wasn't working. You fix it and somebody's very happy with being able to migrate that, right? So I see it and it goes in every direction. It can be
Hmm.
there's a better way for me that I gain something with it, or there's a better way that I can help people where I have the ability to write such a script or a piece of code and somebody else gains from it, right? So yeah, that could be literally anything, right?
Yeah. If I may, I mean, I like that mindset, and sorry to cut you off, but it just reminded me so much of James Clear's, Atomic Habit and, 1% better. Like in the very beginning of that book, he talked about teams that always want to be 1% better, but sometimes people mistaken that 1% better be just like a singular direction, right? Like network automation or Python, for example. Let me be 1% better at Python every day. However, it gets very difficult on the 32nd day, right? Or like on the 15th day. It's very difficult to just get 1% better if you're already at the top level. But like you said, if you just be 1% better, that could be on different aspects. Like you talk about task. So that's, maybe package management, maybe virtual environment, maybe just your CI/CD pipeline. It's easy to have 1% better if you look at it in totality and look at all of your tool sets, all of your skill sets. And on a personal level, maybe it's 1% better on getting better sleep, 1% better at being better relationship with your kids or whatnot. All of these adds up to just having these compounding effects. So I like that fact that you kind of look at in totality and applying that mindset to all aspects, not just the career or Python network automation, stuff like that.
Yeah, well, we spend a lot of time in career, right? So if you
Yes.
can do it there or be better at negotiation skills or your HR talks or your yearly
Presentation. Yeah.
presentation, yeah, could be anything, right? But having it and applying it to everything, right, will gain you something at least, right?
We hope so.
Yeah, in the worst case scenario, you learn something, even though that the solution that you had in mind might not work, right? Either be technical or not. But looking into something, you have gained experience and knowledge on that specific topic.
Right.
And if you can't implement it because of reason ABC, then that's fine because then you've learned that it doesn't fit in that specific scenario, which you learned. So you got better at it also.
Yeah, sometimes people attribute this quote to Michael Jordan, but I don't think it came from him. It's just he's the famous person who, we like to attribute things to. You either win or you learn something, right? You never lose. So back to what you're saying, Bart, on, even if you just spend the time and not coming away with the concrete results, the payout is in your mindset, quote, or in your knowledge of that you gain from reading it.
It is story time with Ethan, courtesy of today's sponsor, Itential. For several years in the pre-automation days, I was on an engineering and architecture team that would help develop standardized code stanzas for new features that we would bake into our managed router offering. Now, once that configuration code was fully tested, we would move into deploying the code to client routers. By hand, often with a network operating system code upgrade required first. And as you can imagine, every so often something would go sideways in the process. The ops tech would fat finger something, a paste buffer would fail over the WAN because reasons. Something, usually a human something, would go wrong. My point is this, back at that time, there was no way to craft an automated process that would make sure the config went in exactly right every time and then share that process with the ops team. They would just punch the change into the CLI like a savage, and often they weren't even knowledgeable enough to react correctly when something went wrong. Time has thankfully moved on. Now we have infrastructure as code, and we've got developer tools and programmatic logic that we can use to code a mature playbook or a script that's got input checking and error handling and testing. And what's more, we can share these tools with our ops team. without them having to understand a thing about the tool's inner workings or even have an environment to run the tool in. Now, how does all of this happen? With Itential. Itential can create an automation execution environment everyone in networking can use safely and reliably. To find out more about Itential's products and how they help you build an automation platform, visit itential.com. You can test drive Itential free for 30 days. That's itential.com.
So, I know we've covered a lot of stuff, and the multiple times that we both feel old. I say, oh my God, things have changed, right? I don't know how many times we said that. I know more than twice.
Yeah, for sure.
So, what are the things that you actually wish you knew sooner, when it comes to maybe programming or when it comes to your tool sets, testing, that sort of stuff? So, what are the things that you wish you knew a little bit sooner looking back?
There's always the technical things, right? That you're like, okay, well, if you talk really on a tiny level, then knowing virtual envs could have been useful, right? Where previously you would install them globally. And I think the recent Python versions don't even let you do that anymore, or not even on root level, right? They've disabled that
Right.
or something. So some things like that, having a package manager versus requirements text file would have been good to know at the start, right? And that's also where a mentor can come in like, oh, have you thought of this? Can make it work, right?
Yeah.
And in the, as Guido wrote it, like it's more read than written, right? The code. So
Yeah. Yeah.
having a formatter, for example, applied makes it easier for you to read, but also when you share it, that people think, and it can structure your code and make it consistent and these kind of things. But above all, on the coding perspective, above all is learn to debug efficiently. Is one of the bigger ones that I would say. I've seen people use print statements, right? We all start there.
Yep.
There's no denying that, but being able to use your tool efficiently, let's say a lot of people use VS Code, and using the breakpoints and the debug and the watch area, which a lot of people are not using, which I cannot fathom, right? It's so useful to be able to watch a variable or watch a specific function output or whatsoever, and just having it pop up every step or every breakpoint, it will show whatever the value is. And being able to do that efficiently will save you so much time.
Yeah, I think the life cycle is where it's missing the most from print statements. The print statement is almost like a snapshot of what is this at this point of time, but the breakpoints and the debuggers tells you the history of, how it became here, step in, step out, and then looping over, as you intended to be. Those are very helpful and probably takes about 10 print statements to an equivalent of a PDB debugging session or whatnot.
Yeah, and that's very much right. And especially now these days, they have the conditional breakpoints in VS Code.
Okay.
Not only the conditional, but it's a triggered breakpoint, I think it's called, where it can be a breakpoint that is only shown if another breakpoint was hit. So you can have very complex situations where, and especially around multi-threading and things like that, where it can become pure chaos, right, in your code. Being able to do that is just superpower.
Yeah.
Right. So debugging, let's not go in too deep, but being able to write a test where you have to parse a JSON file or so ever, and just having that as a test where you can just continuously test against that instead of versus a live API, for example. If you can do that, it will very much shorten your cycle of development. So yeah, I guess those are, from a program perspective, are two main things I would say.
Yeah, I think those are the ones that certainly not day one, right? Like when you're just starting out, obviously you just wanted to get it to work. You want it to be efficient. Yeah, sure. But, at the same time, you just want it to work. But, when it comes to sharing that code with somebody else or continuously improving that code, now you need to do about versioning, right? You need to version so that you know when to push out a new thing to people and people know that you push out a new thing. And like the testing that you're talking about, yeah, you don't want to break things that was already working before. So you do some regression and you do some testing to make sure the new addition, the new features doesn't break what was before. So these are the kind of the day two things that I definitely agree with. Is just the things I wish I know earlier as well. But these are all just like natural progress, right? Like you just kind of grow into it. It's almost like a piece of clothes that it fits before, but now that you grow a little bit bigger, now you have to have new clothes and new things that help you with your journey.
Yeah, true. Though the testing part is what people will try to stay away from, either by choice or not. If you embrace that, then I would say then you're going to gain a lot by embracing that. And once it becomes easy for you to just throw out one or two tests for your thing, then it makes your development cycle so much quicker. It's miraculous.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, right? Sometimes it's forced upon you. So I know for sure, and I could tell you for sure that if you want to contribute code to Network to Code, you got to write some tests. So
Yeah.
it's not really a choice. But we're coming up on time, and I think we could just like chat about all different aspects of it, things you learn. But one thing I do want to talk about before we're closing out is where do we go from here, right? I mean, we kind of talked about history, where you started. We talked about the current state where you're working on and what you feel passionate about, your advices. But let's take a step further. And if you squint your eyes really a little bit, if you could see the future, or if you have a crystal ball that could tell you the future, where do we go from here? What are some of your recommendations for our audience out there?
So it's not too late to step into network automation. Well, let's make that very clear, right?
For sure. I agree.
There's so much to do still. And for the good and the bad, we're not done yet, right?
Oh, we're far from done.
We're far from done, right? So, and we have a huge dependency, right? There's the whole conference, Audicon we spoke about is looking for a better way, right? Is looking for how can we just streamline things from design to implementation to deployment and everything being done and everything around it, right? So including monitoring everything. Just hey, here's a box and it works, right? Pretty much. But we are very much dependent also on vendors to go there, and we've come a long way already. And there's these days it's API first mindset on that, which is already a huge win. But it is not perfect, and it's not necessarily good always, right? So we still need to go there, right? And we still need to be able to have that communication, right? So from a working perspective, there's a lot of opportunities, right, in network automation and being able, when you create the skills to code and to be able to put things together and to have things communicate also from, especially around networking and making those systems communicate with other systems, there is, once you get there, once you achieve that, that's good for you, right? And there will be work in that. So if you're looking for work, this is a good place to be in, right?
Yeah.
And because you're going to be here for a while. And at the same time that we as network automation engineers are talking about this, at the same time, there are so many companies that have not started that journey yet. They are still on the old school, the legacy, however you want to call it. So there is, on one side, so there's just job guarantee in this area. There's still so many people moving. We got the vendors that really need to step in on that, right? So if you're working for a vendor, you can probably, hopefully, can make a difference there to get things better. But yeah, do I see a final streamlined single flow outcome? Well, no, not yet. I think there's too much happening and not standardized per se on all those things yet, right? But can we get closer to that? And yeah, every day is a bit better than yesterday, right?
There's got to be a better way, right?
There's got to be a better way, right? For sure, for sure.
Maybe I could piggyback on that as well. I think it's not just like you said, it's not singular. It's almost like the Marvel universe. Now we have these parallel universes, right? Like, so just pick one that fits your need. And we're in a situation where we could look at other industries, other disciplines, and glean from them because they're kind of further along for us. So I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I was at a Kubernetes meetup. They were talking about KubeCon. They're talking about how they foster open source software. And I think that's a super mature process that we as network automation, we could adapt to it. So I would kind of roger what you said about, well, first, there's got to be a better way. And second, that we could kind of glean from other industries, and having all these multiverses is awesome. We could just pick one that fits your brain and go from there. So, and that's what I would roger as to, what I see as the future as well.
Yeah, no, very true. And we always have to keep in mind, and that's where networking differs from other areas, is usually they are physical, right? And therefore they are not easily changed, or they have a certain lifetime, right? And that makes it sometimes difficult to move forward quickly. Whereas with software or Kubernetes, right? Oh, sure, you put it on a server and poof, there you go. And oh, you need to upgrade your Docker file, like poof, new pod, right? And we're done. And that is very powerful to have, but it's not easily applied to physical stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
right? So, and that's going to remain a challenge, right?
Yeah, but what I was referring to was how the community foster open source projects, which has nothing to do with like the management, but rather for a company not be on the hook or the individual be on the hook for, open source project. They could donate it to the Kubernetes community, then they would take it over, foster it, make sure it runs well, and then release it, having security patches and all that stuff, and kind of graduate from that process. But no, I totally hear what you're saying, and that's where the opportunity is on, just finding out, looking at other discipline as what's good about them and what worked for them, then overlaying that with the network engineering challenges, and then come out with a better solution for our industry. So yeah, Bart, I really enjoyed our conversation. I do want to encourage you to come back if you get another chance. Where can people find you on social? Where can people learn more about your work and follow your progress on different projects?
Yeah, so I would say my LinkedIn is where I'm the most active.
Okay.
Blue Sky's next. If they're looking for my projects, then GitHub would be the good place. I guess those are the top three.
Well, that's plenty.
Very true. Very true.
I try to keep up with LinkedIn. They're taking a toll on me, man. So that's plenty where they can follow you on Blue Sky, GitHub, and LinkedIn. So I want to thank you again for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation. Like I said, I think we kind of came up in the industry at the same time, and now you're making me feel old, but also excited about the future.
Very good. Very good. It was a pleasure being here. So thank you for having me. And keep in mind, there must be a better way.
I like that. So if you learn nothing else, there's got to be a better way. And you heard it first from Bart. Well, thanks again, Bart. And thank you, wonderful listener, for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. If you have any feedbacks for Network Automation, our guest Bart today, or this episode in particular, please do send us follow-ups on packetpushers.net/follow-up. We do really appreciate you and want to hear from you on your feedback. Please do check out the website, packetpushers.net, to find other network engineering focus, blogs, YouTube videos, podcasts, and so much more. You can find podcasts such as Network Break for weekly shows, Heavy Networking for deep dives into networking technologies, Packet Protector for security, and so much more. We do want to thank you, the wonderful listeners, for your support. Last but not least, remember that too much network automation would never be enough.